Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise and provide you with the insights that truly matter. Today, we're plunging into a topic that, well, it often gets dramatically oversimplified in headlines: the incredibly complex and ever evolving nature of global power dynamics. Especially when we look at the intricate relationships between major players, we frequently simplify international relations, maybe viewing nations through just one lens, only to miss the profound underlying forces at play. Forces that shape our world in ways we're perhaps only just beginning to truly grasp. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is a multifaceted deep dive. We're looking at the intertwined relationships, the contrasting scales between India and the United States. And then there's the broader, volatile geopolitical rectangle that also involves Pakistan and China. It's quite a setup. We've gathered a stack of recent analyses, research, our own notes, and we're going to try and extract the critical nuggets of knowledge. The goal is to review how these nations operate on fundamentally different levels, challenging conventional comparisons, and, honestly, highlighting some truly surprising facts along the way. This isn't just about knowing what is happening, it's about understanding why it matters, giving you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on these crucial global dynamics.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here, I think, is how often we, from our own cultural, our own political vantage points, project our systems and assumptions onto other countries. It's almost automatic. The sources for this deep dive truly compel us to reevaluate that perspective. Our recent analyses, which, discuss these very dynamics, they offer a fresh, really detailed viewpoint that moves far beyond the superficial headlines we often consume. They demonstrate that understanding these global relationships requires a much deeper appreciation for cultural nuances, for the unique manifestations of power in different contexts. We'll be looking at how these countries perceive themselves and each other, revealing a landscape far richer, far more complex than a mere economic or military comparison might suggest. It's really about understanding the internal operating logic of these nations.
Absolutely, a perfect way to put it. So let's start by contrasting India and America. Two democracies often superficially compared, right? We tend to look at nations through familiar metrics: GDP, military strength, tech advancement. You know the drill. But our sources argue that cultural gravity is just as, if not more, impactful in shaping a nation's identity and its global footprint. It's not just about what a nation produces, but about how deeply ingrained certain elements are in its collective consciousness, how they bind its people together, and how that internal cohesion, that sort of shared feeling, translates into external influence.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. And to build on that, our sources, they really hammer home the point that when we talk about cultural impact, we're not just dealing with different levels of popularity, it's entirely different roles and functions that culture plays. There is simply no Bollywood equivalent in America, and that's not a slight against Hollywood at all. It's just that Hollywood, for all its global reach, its incredible entertainment value, it doesn't occupy the same deep cultural, emotional, even political space within the United States that Bollywood does for India.
Explain that a bit more. How is it different?
Well, think of it like this. If America's cultural influence is often like a powerful, globally recognized brand,
Hmm.
Coke, Apple, Hollywood movies, India's cultural gravity, especially through Bollywood, is like the very soil and roots of the nation. It nurtures its identity from within. In India, cinema isn't merely entertainment you consume on a Friday night. It's intricately woven into the national fabric. It's stars. They're seen almost as deities by millions.
Like God, seriously?
Well, maybe not literally gods in a religious sense for everyone, but the level of reverence, the emotional investment, it's unparalleled. And the stories in Bollywood films, they often serve as profound social commentary, provoking national dialogue on everything, from tradition to modernity, poverty to wealth, politics to family. And its reach is truly universal. It cuts across linguistic divides, regional differences, socioeconomic classes, in a way very few things can.
That's a crucial distinction. The sources even use the example of Amitabh Bachchan, a huge star, obviously. They say to truly grasp his cultural footprint in America, you'd basically have to combine the influence of top sports icons, think LeBron James or Tom Brady scenes, plus Hollywood celebrities like, Tom Cruise or Meryl Streep, major TV personalities, maybe even leading politicians. And still, the comparison would fall short. That's incredible.
It really is. It falls short in terms of that sheer, pervasive cultural reference. He's not just a celebrity. He's a national icon, a living legend whose career spans decades, whose persona resonates across generations. His words, his actions, even his silences, they carry immense weight in the public sphere.
So what this reveals then, it's not just about individual star power or box office takings. It's about this deeply integrated cultural apparatus, a system that can unify, mobilize, and reflect a national consciousness in ways that are just fundamentally different from Western models.
Exactly. This cultural infrastructure doesn't just entertain. It acts almost like a deeply integrated operating system for the nation. It shapes narratives, reinforces values, commands a kind of collective reverence that Western models, which are often more fragmented or commercially driven, simply don't replicate.
And our sources suggest this isn't just about soft power in the usual sense, it's more foundational.
Yes, it's like a foundational layer of social cohesion. It allows India to project influence in ways that can bypass conventional diplomatic or economic channels. It gives it a unique form of cultural leverage on the world stage. It's about how the nation talks to itself, understands itself.
That internal conversation shaping external actions.
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it suggests that influence isn't solely derived from economic might or political clout or even military power. It comes deeply from this cultural infrastructure, this kind of national connective tissue. This infrastructure binds the nation, shapes its stories, commands that collective reverence we talked about, something we might not fully grasp from our own vantage point. It provides a shared language, shared heroes, shared values that reinforce national identity and cohesion in a way that's frankly difficult to replicate in more fragmented cultural landscapes.
So this deep cultural integration, it's a source of immense soft power, projecting values globally through vibrant arts, popular culture. But it also creates a unique internal dynamic, how the nation functions.
Yes, exactly. It's a collective reverence that can be leveraged, absolutely,
Right.
but it's also one that demands very careful navigation from those in power. Public sentiment, shaped by this culture, is incredibly potent.
That cultural density, the way it binds the nation, it's remarkable. But our sources go further. They show that this same pervasive, deeply integrated energy also manifests in the very practice of democracy itself, operating on a scale and with a power that can feel almost, well, uncontainable, fundamentally different from what we typically observe in the West.
Like how? What examples do they give?
Well, take the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS. Our sources state pretty clearly it has no American counterpart. And that's a crucial insight. To really grasp its scale, imagine a grassroots organization that combines the reach of a massive national volunteer network, like, say, the Red Cross, but much broader, plus the ideological depth of a major cultural movement and the discipline structure of a political cadre, operating everywhere, villages to cities.
So it's not just an advocacy group or a political party wing.
No, not at all. It's described as a profound cultural political force that shapes national discourse and public opinion from the ground up, in a way that simply doesn't exist within the more, maybe fragmented landscape of American civil society or interest groups. We pride ourselves on free speech in the US, right? Formal channels, press conferences, social media. But the sources say in India, that manifests not only there, but also in the everyday act of haggling in local markets, a constant negotiation, a voice for it. And crucially, in the capacity for truly massive, sometimes spontaneous, mass mobilization.
That scale of public participation. It's truly staggering. And it does raise a fascinating, maybe challenging question for our typical understanding of democracy. While it's obviously a powerful expression of free will, does such an uncontainable public mood capable of sudden boycotts or million-strong rallies, does it also present unique challenges for governance, maybe making swift, decisive policy actions more difficult sometimes?
That's a great question. Our sources definitely hint at the complexities of navigating that marketplace of voices, as they call it, for any administration. Public sentiment can quickly outpace official channels.
It's a crucial distinction. It almost redefines the very concept of free expression and democratic engagement, far beyond what Western political scientists might typically model.
Absolutely. It's almost hard to wrap your head around the scale, isn't it? Our sources provide some incredible illustrations. Imagine this. Boycotts of foreign brands. They can just erupt spontaneously and sweep across India, often fueled by nationalist sentiment or maybe a perceived slight. And the key here, according to the sources, is the Indian government can neither initiate such boycotts nor, crucially, stop them once the public mood shifts. Think about that.
Wow. That's a level of decentralized organic public power that's almost unimaginable elsewhere, not top-down.
Exactly. It's not about coordinated political parties necessarily. It's described as a collective, almost intuitive movement. Now, contrast this with American political rallies. U.S. politicians, they consider drawing crowds of 30,000 to be a significant headline-worthy achievement. Needs huge planning, advertising. By stark contrast, our sources reveal that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's small rallies, his small ones begin at 300,000 people, and his larger gatherings easily surpass 1 million, filling vast open spaces.
The logistics alone are mind-boggling.
Right. This isn't just participatory democracy. Our sources describe it as vast, noisy, and uncontainable. A democracy that breathes through its millions of citizens, not just its institutions. And social media just amplifies this energy exponentially. The sheer number of Indians online, their creativity, memes, videos, debates their collective pride. It ensures that any major geopolitical move, any domestic issue, is debated, satirized, magnified instantly across the nation and, frankly, globally. Unlike a country like Canada, for instance, and the sources make this comparison, India cannot stay mum during a crisis. The public voice is simply too loud, too diverse, and too unified in its capacity for collective expression. This collective consciousness means public opinion isn't just a factor, it's a force of nature.
Yeah, that phenomenon adds a layer of complexity to governance, to international relations, that is really distinct from more formalized systems.
Yeah.
And for international actors, especially businesses, this represents a unique kind of market risk, doesn't it? Where consumer mood can suddenly become an unmanageable national force, capable of derailing entire corporate strategies overnight.
A sort of sentiment risk.
Exactly. It's that marketplace of voices where narratives are shaped not just by official statements or media campaigns, but by the collective will of millions, expressed on all sorts of informal and digital platforms. This underscores that while the machinery of state power is obviously important, the power of collective public sentiment and its capacity for spontaneous nationwide action, it's an equally, if not more, potent force in India. Overlooking this is basically to misunderstand the very fabric of Indian society and how it behaves on the world stage.
So, what happens then? When these distinct cultural scales, these democratic scales, these immense forces of public sentiment, what happens when they collide with something like economic policy? Our sources reveal a pretty precarious situation surrounding the current tariff standoff between the U.S. and India. The U.S. administration's imposition of, 50% tariffs on Indian imports? That risks triggering a backlash of unpredictable proportions, precisely because of the unique nature of Indian public sentiment we've just been talking about.
And the advice given to sources is quite blunt, isn't it?
It is. The advice for American policymakers, directly from our sources, is clear. They should wisely walk back these tariffs before consumer sentiment in India shifts decisively, irrevocably, against U.S. brands. This isn't just framed as economics, it explicitly emphasizes the direct, powerful link between tariffs and public mood, far beyond what a typical trade negotiation might consider.
Yeah, this isn't just a traditional trade dispute where two governments haggle over percentage points in some closed room. It's presented as a potential masterclass in soft power and strategic influence from India's side. India's capacity to leverage not just its diplomatic standing, but also its domestic political savvy, its diaspora within the U.S. It showcases a comprehensive, really sophisticated approach to protecting its interests.
Yeah.
It moves far beyond mere economic statistics. It engages with a multi-layered understanding of power.
Playing chess, not checkers, as the saying goes.
Pretty much. It suggests that in a multipolar world, trade negotiations are increasingly intertwined with broader geopolitical strategies, with domestic public opinion, with the nation's ability to activate its cultural and demographic assets.
And our sources actually lay out India's multi-pronged leverage in this specific situation. They offer very concrete examples of how India could exert pressure. First, they suggest India could position itself as a global peacemaker, leverage its growing diplomatic capital. Imagine Prime Minister Modi, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, National Security Advisor Doval, engaging in high-stakes diplomacy. Our sources hypothesize, and it is a hypothesis, but an interesting one, that if they were to successfully broker an end to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, maybe through a weekend of intense, successful shuttle diplomacy in New Delhi, something India has been increasingly positioned for, that global goodwill, that enhanced diplomatic stature, could peel away 25% of the U.S. tariff burden almost instantly.
Wow. That's linking major global diplomacy directly to trade relief.
Exactly. It underscores India's rising influence, its potential role as a crucial mediator on the world stage, and how that translates diplomatic wins into tangible economic gains.
Indeed, it speaks volumes about India's growing stature, not just regional power, but potential global mediator. This kind of diplomatic leverage is a powerful tool. It reflects a level of trust, or at least perceived neutrality and influence, that transcends traditional economic might. It highlights a strategic understanding that foreign policy and trade policy aren't siloed. They're interconnected, each influencing the other. The ability to command that kind of international respect gives India a unique bargaining chip.
Okay, so that's one potential lever, global diplomacy. What about the remaining 25% of the tariffs? Here, our sources suggest India's political acumen could come into play by strategically pitting U.S. domestic lobbies against each other.
Playing the internal U.S. political game.
Precisely. They could, for instance, meticulously identify and engage powerful American industry groups whose interests are directly harmed by these tariffs. Imagine India, through its diplomats, maybe its diaspora networks, strategically engaging American agricultural lobbies, highlighting how tariffs on Indian textiles or maybe auto parts could inadvertently lead to retaliatory Indian tariffs on huge U.S. agricultural exports, soybeans, almonds, whatever. India's a massive market.
Right, creating internal opposition within the U.S.
Or consider Big Pharma. Their access to India's vast and growing market for medicines might be jeopardized by escalating trade tensions. Or Big Tech, which relies heavily on India for skilled labor, R&D centers, and a massive consumer base. This creates an internal pressure point for U.S. lawmakers. It effectively pits one powerful domestic industry against another, pushing for a rollback of tariffs perhaps more effectively than just direct government-to-government negotiation alone could achieve.
That shows a really sophisticated understanding of the American political system, doesn't it? How lobbying works, how different interest groups compete. It demonstrates that India can navigate these complex lobbying efforts, leverage diverse domestic interests within the U.S. to its own advantage. That's a highly strategic, very nuanced approach to international negotiations. Recognizing that domestic political pressures can be just as potent, sometimes more so, than international ones. Finding the cracks in the opposition's armor.
And there's even more leverage outlined by our sources. It doesn't stop there. A mobilized Indian diaspora in the U.S., which is large, increasingly affluent, and politically active, including powerful groups like the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, VHP, in America, they could amplify the pressure significantly. Think strategic outreach to influential figures in American politics. The sources mention someone like Nikki Haley, who has strong ties to the Indian-American community, and an Israel-style lobbying push on Capitol Hill. That phrase suggests a highly organized, well-funded, and effective model of advocacy.
Making the tariffs politically costly for U.S. lawmakers.
Exactly. The sheer volume of constituents combined with targeted messaging focused on economic impact or strategic partnership. It could shift the legislative mood. Furthermore, down the line, U.S. courts could potentially strike down the tariffs on legal grounds, depending on how they were implemented, leaving maybe only token barriers. So the playbook here isn't just one thing. It's not just direct negotiation or simple economic retaliation. It's about leveraging every available lever. High-level diplomacy, domestic political pressure within the U.S., diaspora mobilization, legal challenges, showcasing a truly comprehensive strategy.
It really is a comprehensive approach. It reflects a deep understanding of how power operates in the 21st century, not just in Washington, but globally. This capacity for multi-layered influence, it's a key characteristic of emerging global powers in a multipolar world. They're not just playing by the old rules, they're writing new ones, demonstrating how cultural, demographic, political factors intertwine with economic ones. And these distinct characteristics of India's democracy, its unique cultural weight, its growing economic leverage against external pressure, they naturally lead us to the broader geopolitical theater where it operates, specifically that complex and often dangerous rectangle involving the U.S., Pakistan, India, and China. This is where those internal dynamics meet the harsh external realities of regional security.
Okay, let's zoom out now, as you said, to the intricate geopolitical chessboard of South Asia. India isn't just dealing with trade disputes, obviously. Our sources describe this enduring and volatile strategic rectangle. U.S., Pakistan, India, China. It's a region layered with complex history, ideological clashes, great power maneuvering, all of which continues to shape global security today. It's easy to forget sometimes that the Soviet Union's collapse more than 3 decades ago now made Pakistan's Cold War-era role, Washington's frontline ally against Moscow's Afghan adventure, largely irrelevant in that original context.
The original rationale disappeared.
Right. Yet this strategic rectangle endures. It's just now complicated by different factors. The persistent challenge of state-sponsored terrorism and the ever-present terrifying specter of nuclear escalation between two of its key players, India and Pakistan.
And that historical overview is so critical because it highlights how geopolitical relationships are absolutely not static. They're constantly evolving. Old alliances lose relevance as global circumstances shift. New economic ties create deep dependencies. The very nature of conflict itself evolved from Cold War standoffs to proxy wars and terrorism. making the region a potential flashpoint for global security. What was once a strategic asset for one power, as you said about Pakistan for the U.S., can indeed become a liability in a changed world, and we see that clearly in Pakistan's evolving role within this rectangle. The old Cold War logic has just been replaced by something far more diffuse, far more dangerous.
Exactly. Pakistan's value to Washington once lay in its geography, its strategic access. During the Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 89, Islamabad's Inter-Services Intelligence, the ISI, famously funneled billions in CIA and Saudi dollars to Mujahideen fighters. It was the conduit for that proxy war. And we shouldn't forget Henry Kissinger's secret trip from Islamabad to Beijing in 1971. That paved the way for Nixon's historic U.S.-China rapprochement. Pakistan was the hinge.
A pivotal moment in 20th century diplomacy.
Absolutely. But our sources tell us that today these legacies are seen less as assets and more as liabilities, especially in the context of persistent regional instability and the rise of new global challenges like transnational terrorism. The old utility has vanished, leaving a very complicated residue.
And it's fascinating how dramatically the landscape has shifted since then. Pakistan is now, as our sources detail, economically and militarily tied very closely to China, mainly through massive investments like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. That's a flagship project of Beijing's huge Belt and Road Initiative. It creates deep dependencies. Yet, ironically, Pakistan's dependence on U.S. aid for counterterrorism persists, creating this complex, often contradictory set of allegiances. It's pulled in multiple directions.
While India, by contrast,
India has moved much closer to Washington, deepening defense cooperation, particularly through platforms like the Quadjet Glow-Iraq, the strategic dialogue between the U.S., India, Japan, and Australia, plus signing significant arms deals with the U.S. and other Western partners. This firmly positions India as a critical Indo-Pacific counterweight to China's growing regional dominance. It completely reorients the power dynamics of that old rectangle.
so the traditional Cold War triangle, U.S., Pakistan, India, has really stretched into this more complex, four-sided figure, Washington and Beijing on one axis, maybe Islamabad and New Delhi on the other, creating constant tension. But unlike the Cold War, where it was mainly about ideology, communism versus capitalism, now terrorism, specifically state-sponsored terrorism, according to our sources, defines these fault lines with lethal clarity.
How so? What's the direct accusation?
Pakistan's ISI, for instance, is accused by our sources and by Indian intelligence for decades of systematically redirecting Afghan jihadist networks toward India after the Soviet withdrawal, effectively repurposing fighters and infrastructure. This strategic shift, they argue, led directly to the spawning of notorious groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, LTT, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, GEM groups, which have since carried out devastating attacks on Indian soil, including the Mumbai attacks, Pathankot, Uri, Pulwama. The list is long.
And we've seen Washington navigate a very complex, often contradictory path for decades regarding Pakistan, haven't we? Oscillating between sanctioning Islamabad for its perceived double dealing, providing safe havens and supporting it for specific counterterrorism cooperation when needed. We saw the drama of the raid that killed Osama bin Laden at Abbottabad, Pakistan in 2011. That raised huge questions. Then there were aid suspensions over allegations of providing sanctuaries to the Taliban. The U.S. has struggled to find a consistent approach.
Meanwhile, China
China has consistently used its power, particularly its UN Security Council veto, to shield Pakistan from international accountability, famously delaying the designation of GEM leader Masood Azhar as a global terrorist until 2019, despite overwhelming evidence presented by multiple countries. This demonstrates that deep strategic alignment between Beijing and Islamabad and the profound implications of China's growing influence, especially through CPEC, on regional stability and international counterterrorism efforts. Beijing's actions really complicate any unified international response. They provide diplomatic cover.
Which brings us to where it gets really interesting and tragically specific. Our sources pinpoint a recent harrowing catalyst that brought these simmering tensions to a boiling point: the Pahalgam attack. The date they cite is April 22, 2025. A seemingly ordinary day for tourists in the picturesque Kashmiri town of Pahalgam turned into an absolute nightmare. Militants launched a brutal attack, killing 26 innocent civilians, wounding dozens more, shattering the peace of that region. And the Resistance Front, or TRF, an outfit the sources confirm, is directly linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba, quickly claimed responsibility, making it clear this wasn't random, it was part of a larger coordinated strategy.
Yeah, that incident, as described, wasn't an anomaly. It was presented as a critical moment that laid bare this long-standing pattern of statecraft, of proxy warfare in the region. And the subsequent Indian investigation and response were swift, decisive, and particularly revealing in the sheer depth of evidence they apparently uncovered.
They were indeed. Indian investigations, according to the material we reviewed, traced the attackers directly to 3 Pakistani nationals, all unequivocally connected to Letti's cross-border networks, receiving guidance, support, logistics from across the border. India's response was swift and robust, codenamed Operation Sindoor. It targeted terror infrastructure deep within Pakistan-administered Kashmir and also in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. Indian officials were careful to emphasize it was calibrated force, echoing previous responses like the 2016 Uri surgical strikes after that base attack and the 2019 Balakot airstrikes after the Pulwama bombing.
So signaling a consistent strategic approach to cross-border terrorism,
Yeah.
not just absorbing attacks anymore.
Exactly, a shift in posture. No longer content with just absorbing attacks, but actively taking measures to dismantle the infrastructure that supports them, even across the line of control.
And the evidence India presented to the United States, to other international bodies. Our sources describe it as compelling and extensive. Intercepted communications, detailed financial trails linking attackers directly to ISI handlers, forensic analysis. The works. Our sources note this case closely paralleled earlier, equally damning dossiers, especially on the 2008 Mumbai attacks, where Letti's links to Pakistan's state apparatus were undeniable, extensively documented by multiple agencies.
And it wasn't just Indian claims.
No. Reports from respected institutions like the Brookings Institution, various think tanks, consistently confirm that militant proxies remain a deeply ingrained instrument of Pakistan's strategic depth doctrine against India. That's strategic depth doctrine. It essentially involves using non-state actors, proxy groups to exert influence, maintain leverage over adversaries, particularly India, allows Pakistan to operate below the threshold of conventional warfare, creating plausible deniability, at least in theory.
And despite Pakistan's usual, almost immediate denials, which are pretty standard in these situations, the sheer weight and consistency of the evidence, according to our sources, became impossible to ignore, even for its allies. Testimonies from captured militants, corroborated satellite imagery showing active terror camps, and then the startling 2025 admission mentioned in the sources by Pakistan's own defense minister acknowledging decades of state support for Kashmir-focused groups. That must have been huge.
A major crack in the narrative, definitely. Delivered, presumably under immense internal and external pressure.
And on social media, the public reaction was intense. Hashtags like #PahalgamTruth, #IsoTerror trended worldwide, echoing the massive public outcry we saw after Pulwama in 2019, after Mumbai in 2008. The sheer volume and consistency of evidence, coupled with that high-level admission, it made it increasingly difficult for international players to just look away, to maintain the usual diplomatic ambiguity.
It really does raise profound questions about the strategic intent behind such attacks and the responses they trigger, and how they play into the broader geopolitical dynamics of this nuclear-armed region.
And this leads us, as you mentioned earlier, to a critical, almost unavoidable parallel that our sources draw, suggesting that what we see happening in South Asia is eerily similar to dynamics in other highly volatile regions like the Middle East. And that demands a consistent international response if principles like state sovereignty and non-interference are to mean anything.
What's the specific parallel they draw?
To Iran. For India, they argue, Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism is no less clear, no less egregious than Iran's sponsorship of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Just as Tehran channels funds, weapons, ideological support into its axis of resistance across the Middle East. Pakistan's ISI is accused of actively nurturing and directing groups invoking the Ghazwa-i-Hind prophecy.
Do you explain that term, Ghazwa-i-Hind?
Yeah, it's described as an apocalyptic jihadist vision of India's conquest. It's not just a general religious idea. It's a specific, deeply provocative concept within certain militant narratives. It frames the struggle against India as a divinely mandated final battle. For groups like Jem and Letti, invoking Ghazwa-i-Hind is apparently a powerful recruitment tool, a justification for extreme violence. It paints India not merely as a political rival, but as an existential religious enemy to be overcome, legitimizing extreme actions in the eyes of followers.
And it's important, as our sources note, that while Ghazwa-i-Hind isn't official Pakistani state policy, you won't find it in government documents. Its pervasive presence in the narratives of these groups means it's a de facto driver of regional instability, precisely because groups like Jem and Letti frequently invoke it to recruit fighters, justify attacks. After the Pahalgam attack, TRF statements, as documented by our sources, explicitly invoke that same imagery, directly linking their actions to this prophecy.
So the argument analysts make is, If Pakistan's establishment cannot or will not formally disavow such ideology and actively dismantle the groups that propagate it, then it effectively becomes de facto policy through inaction or tacit approval. Much like, perhaps, Iran's clerical leadership can't realistically renounce its proxy network in the Middle East without undermining its own revolutionary ideology.
And this raises that important question not just about regional stability, but about the foundations of international law and accountability. How do we differentiate between state actors and non-state actors when the lines are deliberately blurred like this?
And this analogy, this parallel with Iran, matters profoundly when we talk about international consistency. Washington, for instance, designates Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as a foreign terrorist organization, imposes extensive sanctions on its global networks, citing its clear sponsorship of terror. This raises the critical question our sources pose. Why should Pakistan's ISI, with comparable, extensive, decades-long evidence of proxy warfare and backing of UN-designated terror groups, why should it be treated differently by the international community?
It's a powerful question about double standards.
Exactly. The sources argue this perceived double standard undermines the credibility of global counterterrorism efforts. It suggests strategic interests sometimes trump universal principles.
And this inconsistency is further complicated, maybe even exacerbated, by China's role. China's so-called all-weather friendship with Pakistan often serves as a crucial shield for Islamabad on the world stage. Beijing has repeatedly blocked UN designations of Pakistani terrorists, as we mentioned, undermining collective international efforts to hold these groups and their state sponsors accountable. Our sources point out that Chinese state media consistently downplayed the Pahalgam attack. They framed Operation Sindoor, India's response, as just mutual escalation, not as an Indian response to clear Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. That framing speaks volumes about their strategic alignment and their willingness to provide diplomatic cover.
Protecting their allies.
And if a major power like China, a permanent member of the Security Council, continues to shield a state with such strong, consistent evidence of supporting terror, it not only undermines collective security efforts globally, but it also creates a really dangerous precedent. It profoundly impacts the long-term strategic implications of China's own stance as a rising global player. It raises serious questions about Beijing's commitment to international norms and genuine counterterrorism.
And there's a profound, almost tragic irony here, too, highlighted in the material. While these massive CPEC investments, part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, are designed to tie China to Pakistan's stability through infrastructure, economic development, they ironically seem to fuel instability on the ground in some areas. Baloch insurgents, for example, have repeatedly targeted Chinese workers, Chinese infrastructure projects in Balochistan, citing Beijing's perceived complicity in Pakistan's internal repression in the province and its exploitation of local resources. This puts Chinese interests directly in the crosshairs.
So China's investment is actually creating new security problems for itself.
In some ways, yes. Yet despite these challenges, despite the clear evidence of Pakistan's terror sponsorship that affects regional stability, Beijing continues to provide diplomatic and economic cover, prioritizing its strategic rivalry with India, its partnership with Islamabad over transparency and genuine counterterrorism efforts. So for this volatile strategic rectangle to ever stabilize, our sources argue quite forcefully, China must come clean.
What does come clean mean in practical terms?
It means ending its protective vetoes at the UN Security Council. It means auditing its own indirect support, financial or otherwise, that might flow to Pakistan and inadvertently assist these networks. And it means actively pressuring Islamabad, using its considerable leverage, to finally dismantle the India-focused terror networks operating from its soil. Without that kind of accountability, the argument goes, Beijing risks becoming complicit in the very militancy it claims to oppose globally, and ironically, endangers its own citizens and investments in the region.
That's a critical demand for China. It emphasizes that its strategic choices have profound implications for global counterterrorism efforts, for regional stability, far beyond its immediate economic interests in Pakistan. Its actions, or inactions, will really define whether it is seen as a responsible global power genuinely committed to stability or as an enabler of state-sponsored terrorism. And that directly impacts the global effort to combat such threats, especially when one of the UN's permanent 5 members is implicated, even indirectly, in such a manner.
So, given all this incredibly complex, perilous, nuclear-armed, strategic rectangle, What concrete actions can the United States actually take to move beyond just crisis management, just putting out fires? Our sources clearly outline Washington's unique leverage and the critical choices it faces, emphasizing that the traditional balancing act, trying to keep both India and Pakistan happy, is probably no longer sustainable.
What tools does the U.S. still have?
Well, the United States retains unmatched tools for verification, for monitoring these networks, everything from NSA surveillance of financial flows tracking the money later, to CIA monitoring of training camps, satellite imagery, human intelligence, plus crucial partnerships like the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Network, which pools vast amounts of global intelligence. And the post 9/11 mechanisms already exist to track things like Hawala financing, that informal money transfer system often used by illicit groups and terror logistics globally, meaning Washington has the technical capacity to know, with a high degree of certainty, exactly what's happening on the ground. The issue isn't lack of information, it's lack of political will or a clear strategy.
And this is really a pivotal moment for U.S. foreign policy in South Asia, isn't it? The sources argue that continuing the traditional balancing act, trying to be a close ally to both India and Pakistan simultaneously, it's just no longer a viable strategy. Not given the evolving dynamics, the clear alignment shifts, and the, frankly, undeniable evidence regarding Pakistan's proxy warfare against India. The ethical imperatives standing against terrorism and the strategic imperatives partnering with a rising democratic power like India against an assertive China, they seem to be converging, demanding a decisive shift, moving from reactive, ad hoc diplomacy rushing in after an attack to a proactive, accountable framework that sets clear conditions and expectations. The status quo, they argue, is eroding stability, not preserving it.
And the U.S. has shown in the past it can apply significant pressure when it chooses to. Washington suspended $300 million in coalition support funds aid to Pakistan back in 2018, citing terror safe havens. That demonstrated its capacity to apply financial pressure when its patience wears thin. It could escalate such measures, even threaten Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, blacklisting. And for those unfamiliar, FATF blacklisting, that's a really severe measure. It effectively cuts a nation off from the global financial system, makes international trade, investment, borrowing incredibly difficult, turns a country into an economic pariah.
A devastating blow.
Absolutely. That would be a devastating blow if Islamabad fails to act decisively and verifiably against these groups. However, the Pahalgam crisis, as described in our sources, also highlighted the limits of U.S. patience and its often reactive posture. We saw Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, according to the timeline, shuttling intensely between New Delhi and Islamabad in May 2025 to prevent escalation after Operation Sindoor, with President Trump later claiming credit for averting nuclear brinkmanship. Standard political stuff. But the sources emphasize this kind of reactive firefighting, this crisis diplomacy, it cannot substitute for a long-term, coherent strategy that addresses the root causes of instability.
It's like putting out fires while the arsonist continues to operate freely next door.
Exactly. You can't keep doing that forever.
So the core of the argument here, from these analyses, is that the U.S. needs to move beyond crisis management, embrace a more foundational shift in its approach to the region. And this requires careful consideration of the potential risks, the potential benefits of each strategic option available to Washington. Because maintaining the status quo, as our sources highlight, is itself a risk. It tacitly enables continued instability, maybe even encourages it.
And our sources lay out three very distinct strategic options for the U.S. going forward, not easy choices. First, they suggest an audit and disconnect. What does that mean? Washington should demand verifiable dismantlement of ISI-backed terror networks, conditioning all aid, military, economic, directly on Islamabad's demonstrable sustained compliance. This means setting clear, measurable benchmarks and actually following through on consequences if they aren't met, making aid conditional on concrete action, not just vague promises or temporary crackdowns. It would involve a comprehensive review of all U.S. assistance to ensure none of it is inadvertently enabling or indirectly supporting these networks.
Okay, so this option focuses heavily on accountability, on conditionality, forcing Pakistan to make a clear choice: reform or face isolation from U.S. support. The potential risk here, of course, is that it could further alienate Pakistan, maybe push it even deeper into China's orbit, or, in a worst-case scenario, further destabilize the nuclear-armed state if support is cut off abruptly. But the benefit is a clear, unambiguous U.S. stance against state-sponsored terror, and potentially a more reliable partner in counterterrorism down the road if Pakistan genuinely commits to reform under pressure.
Okay, that's option one, audit and disconnect. The second option presented is quite bold: side with India. If Pakistan unequivocally refuses genuine reform, if it continues its proxy warfare despite clear evidence and warnings, then Washington must align decisively, unequivocally, with India as its primary Indo-Pacific partner, full stop. This would involve elevating India to an unparalleled strategic status, deepening intelligence sharing, military cooperation, diplomatic support across the board, making it crystal clear where U.S. loyalties and strategic priorities lie in the region. This would be a significant, truly historic shift in U.S. foreign policy, ending decades of attempting to balance relations between New Delhi and Islamabad.
Yeah, that option represents a clear, sharp departure from past policies. It acknowledges that the status quo of trying to balance both nations is maybe just unsustainable or even counterproductive now. The potential benefits: a much more robust, reliable partnership with India, the world's largest democracy; a clearer moral and strategic stance against state-sponsored terrorism; strengthening India's role as a democratic counterweight to China's influence in the region and beyond. The risks, however, are substantial, as you'd expect. Completely losing any remaining influence with Pakistan, a nuclear state with deep ties to militants in China, and potentially fueling further regional tensions, maybe even pushing Pakistan towards more desperate measures. It's high stakes.
High stakes indeed. And then finally, the third option laid out: broker transparency with China. Here, the U.S. would actively press Beijing using diplomatic leverage, maybe linking it to cooperation on other global issues like climate change or trade dollars, to end its diplomatic shielding of Pakistan at the UN and other international forums, exposing the full terror ecosystem for global scrutiny. The goal here is to strip away Pakistan's international cover provided by China and hold China itself accountable for its role in enabling this regional instability, making it harder for Beijing to play both sides.
So this option tries to change the behavior of the enabler, China, rather than just focusing on Pakistan directly or choosing India exclusively. It's perhaps the most complex diplomatically. Success would depend heavily on U.S. leverage over China, which fluctuates. The benefit could be a more stable region if China actually shifts its policy. The risk is that China simply refuses, calls the U.S. bluff, and nothing changes, potentially weakening the U.S. position.
Right. So 3 distinct paths: audit and disconnect from Pakistan based on compliance, fully side with India, or try to broker transparency with China. None are easy choices. Each carries significant geopolitical weight, potential blowback, but they are presented in our source material as essential considerations for long-term stability and for the U.S. to maintain both its moral standing and its strategic leadership in a critical part of the world.
Exactly. These 3 options are designed to move beyond mere crisis management, advocating for that foundational shift in U.S. strategy we discussed. The choice now, as presented, is between maintaining an increasingly untenable balance that has arguably perpetuated regional instability and making a decisive move towards a potentially more stable, albeit significantly realigned regional order. Each path requires political courage, clear communication, and carries significant implications for how international relations are conducted in this multipolar world, especially regarding the definition and handling of state-sponsored terrorism. It's a defining moment.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground. We've navigated the vastly different scales of democracy and trade between India and America, uncovering insights into India's unique cultural gravity, that uncontainable public will. We've also explored the volatile strategic rectangle involving Pakistan and China, ignited by events like the Pahalgam attack, fueled by the persistent dangerous issue of state-sponsored terrorism. So how do these seemingly distinct narratives connect? And, maybe more importantly, what does all this mean for you as someone trying to understand this complex, shifting global landscape?
I think the connection is fundamental.
Go on.
What both of these deep dives highlight is this profound, often overlooked shift in global power dynamics. India is clearly not just a quiet market you can simply tap for profits, or a passive geopolitical player you can manage with old Cold War playbooks.
Its massive, decentralized, vocal democratic base, combined with its growing diplomatic muscle, its economic leverage, it means India cannot be dealt with using conventional diplomatic or trade strategies from a bygone era. You simply can't apply a one-size-fits-all Western template and expect it to work. So understanding this is critical.
Absolutely critical. For anyone looking at modern international relations, global trade, counterterrorism efforts, the delicate balance of power in this increasingly multipolar world, the way Washington and indeed other global powers navigates both trade disputes like the tariff issue and regional security in South Asia, it will have profound implications far beyond the immediate region. Far beyond. Ignoring these complexities, these uneven scales of a societal and political operation in India, and the enduring dangerous dynamics of the strategic rectangle, it's simply no longer an option if you want to be realistic. The actions, or maybe the inactions, of key players today will have cascading effects on global stability, on economic opportunity for decades to come. They're shaping the geopolitical landscape for future generations right now.
So this isn't just a clash of policies, then, or economic interests.
No, I think our sources suggest it's fundamentally a clash of scales and styles. Styles of governance, styles of public engagement, scales of population and cultural influence. The underlying message for Washington, and maybe for American corporations too, seems clear. India is a marketplace of voices, of national pride, of immense power that demands a deeply nuanced, respectful, and sophisticated approach, one that acknowledges its distinct internal operating logic. It's a country where public sentiment, as we saw, can quickly become an uncontainable national force, capable of shaping economic and political outcomes in truly unexpected ways. And overlooking the complexities, the moral imperatives within that U.S.-Pakistan-India-China dynamic, especially concerning state-sponsored terrorism, risks regional instability with potentially global reverberations, consequences we simply cannot afford to ignore.
It forces us to challenge our own preconceived notions, perhaps, about power, about influence.
Exactly. It asks us to adapt our analytical frameworks to fit a rapidly changing multipolar world order where power manifests in ways beyond just military divisions or GDP figures.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. Really complex, often misunderstood dynamics between India, America, Pakistan, and China. We've explored India's unique, formidable presence culturally, democratically, geopolitically, the precarious challenges of the tariff standoff, the enduring instability within that U.S.-Pakistan, India-China rectangle fueled by terrible events like Pahalgam. So here's where it gets really interesting. Or perhaps a final thought for you to chew on long after this deep dive concludes.
Okay, let's hear it.
Our sources conclude pretty starkly that if Washington miscalculates on trade with India, it won't be Indian consumers bearing the primary burden. American brands will ultimately bear the significant cost. Losing access to a vital, growing market facing fierce, unmanageable public backlash fueled by that unique cultural and democratic energy we discussed. And within the strategic rectangle, the sources warn the next Pahalgam-like incident could very well ignite a crisis too immense for traditional reactive diplomacy to contain, potentially pushing a nuclear-armed region past a critical threshold from which it's hard to return. So consider this. In a rapidly shifting global landscape where cultural density and mass mobilization are becoming less potent, maybe more potent, than traditional economic or military might, how much longer can those traditional diplomatic balancing acts truly hold? What happens when a clash of scales and styles, as you put it, becomes a fundamental challenge to global stability, demanding decisive, proactive leadership rather than just reactive crisis management? How will the world respond when the very definitions of power and influence are being rewritten, not just by governments, but by the collective will of millions?
That really raises an important question for all of us, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do we adapt our understanding of international relations to these evolving realities? Realities where the voices of millions, amplified by social media, amplified by deep cultural pride, can fundamentally reshape economic outcomes, security outcomes, diplomatic negotiations. It compels us to think beyond conventional wisdom, beyond the old paradigms, to embrace a more holistic, culturally sensitive, strategically integrated approach to global affairs. The old maps, our sources seem to be telling us, simply aren't enough to navigate this new, complex terrain. We need new ways of seeing.
Indeed. New ways of seeing in a rapidly changing world. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this exploration has given you a fresh perspective, maybe challenged some assumptions, and encouraged you to continue exploring these critical topics. Until next time, stay curious.